They called it the mercy rule, though there was nothing merciful about it. On Thornhill Plantation in northern Georgia, between 1789 and 1862, more than 300 people lived and died under a regulation so strange, so specific, that when a journalist from Harper's Weekly finally investigated in 1866, he burned his notes rather than publish what he discovered. The rule itself was simple enough to state, but impossible to understand. Every person at Thornhill, enslaved and free alike, had to speak the same final words before sleep each night. "I am grateful for Thornhill's protection." 7 words, spoken aloud, every single night, without exception for 73 years. Miss one night, just one, and the punishment wasn't whipping or sale or any cruelty the overseers could devise. The punishment came from something else entirely, something that arrived in the darkness between midnight and dawn, something that left behind evidence so disturbing that neighboring plantations refused to discuss Thornhill in polite company. When Sherman's forces finally reached the property in November of 1864, they found the buildings intact, the fields unharvested, and every single person gone, vanished as if they'd simply stepped out of existence. The only clue was a message carved into every doorframe, every window, every surface that could hold letters, carved so many times it must have taken days. We stopped saying it. Before we go deeper into what happened at Thornhill, into the nights when the rule was broken and what came after, I need something from you. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this story goes to places that will make you question everything you think you know about history. And down in the comments, tell me where you're watching from, what time it is there, because after you hear what I'm about to tell you, you'll understand why that matters. You'll understand why some words should never be left unsaid. The Mercy Rule began on September 17th, 1789. The same night, Thornhill Plantation's founder, Josiah Thornhill, returned from burying his wife and 3 children in an unmarked grave 2 miles from the property line. What happened in those woods, what Josiah found waiting at that burial site, was never written down, never spoken of directly, but it changed everything. Before that night, Thornhill had been unremarkable, just another mid-sized plantation working 63 people in the red clay hills of Georgia. After that night, it became something else, a place where words had weight, where silence was dangerous, where saying the right thing at the right time was the only barrier between life and something worse than death. Josiah Thornhill was 34 years old when he created the rule. He'd inherited the plantation from his father in 1785, married a woman named Margaret from Savannah, fathered 3 children in quick succession, and seemed destined for the comfortable obscurity of minor gentry. Then came the fever. It swept through Thornhill in late August of 1789, killing Margaret and all 3 children, ages 7, 5, and 2, within a single week. The fever was strange, unlike anything the local doctor had seen. The victims didn't burn hot. They went cold, their skin taking on a grey pallor, their breath coming in white mists, even in the summer heat. They spoke in their delirium, but not in English or any language the doctor recognized. They spoke in rhythms that hurt to hear, syllables that seemed to echo wrong in the ear. And they all said the same thing before they died, that something was waiting for them, something that had been waiting a very long time. Josiah buried them himself, refusing help, taking the bodies deep into the woods north of the plantation, where the land turned swampy and strange. He was gone for 2 days. When he returned, he was different. His hair had gone completely white. Though he was only 34, his eyes had a hollowness that never quite left, and he carried with him a conviction so absolute, so unshakable, that no one dared question it. He gathered everyone at Thornhill, enslaved and free, in the main yard on the evening of September 17th. There were 63 enslaved people, 5 overseers, a handful of household staff, and Josiah himself, 71 people in total. He stood before them with no notes, no hesitation, and spoke words that would govern their lives for the next 73 years. "There is something in these woods that takes," he said, his voice carrying across the yard in the stillness of dusk. "It took my family. It will take more unless we give it something else. Something it wants more than flesh and blood. It wants acknowledgement. It wants gratitude. It wants to be recognized." He paused, looking at each face in turn. "From tonight forward, every person on this property will speak these words before sleep. I am grateful for Thornhill's protection. Every night, without fail, without exception. These words are a contract, a bargain. As long as they are spoken, as long as the gratitude is given, what waits in the woods will remain in the woods. But if even one person forgets, if even one person refuses, the contract is broken, and what waits will come to collect." There was silence. Complete silence. Then someone asked the question everyone was thinking: what happens if we don't say it? Josiah's expression didn't change. "You'll find out," he said simply, "and you'll wish you hadn't." That night, 71 voices spoke the same 7 words before sleep. Some spoke them with conviction, some spoke them with fear, some spoke them with resentment, barely contained. But they all spoke them, because Josiah Thornhill had come back from those woods changed, and whatever had changed him was not something anyone wanted to meet. Among those who spoke the words that first night was a woman named Esther. She was 26 years old, brought to Thornhill 3 years earlier from a plantation in South Carolina. She worked in the main house, close enough to Josiah to see the haunted look that never left his eyes, close enough to hear him talking to himself in the library late at night, rehearsing the words, testing them, as if afraid he'd forget. Esther was smart, dangerously so, with a memory that captured every detail of every conversation. She'd learned to hide her intelligence, to play at being simple, because intelligence in an enslaved woman was seen as threatening. But she was always watching, always listening, always trying to understand the world she'd been forced into. The mercy rule fascinated and terrified her in equal measure, because Josiah enforced it with an intensity that went beyond ordinary cruelty. He didn't just require the words, he required belief. Every evening, just before sunset, an overseer would walk through the cabins and the main house listening. You had to say the words clearly, loud enough to be heard. You couldn't mumble them or rush through them. You had to speak them with something approaching sincerity, with gratitude that sounded real, even if your heart was full of rage. Some people found this easy. They spoke the words mechanically, like a prayer said so many times it lost all meaning. But others struggled. Some nights, Esther heard people in the cabins practicing the words, trying to get the tone right, terrified of sounding too bitter or too hollow. Because Josiah could tell. Somehow he always knew when someone's gratitude was false, and those people would be called to the main house the next morning. They wouldn't be punished, not in any conventional sense. They would simply be reminded. Josiah would sit them down in his study, pour them water, and tell them very calmly what he'd seen in those woods the night he buried his family. He never gave details. He never described what was waiting. He just said enough to ensure they understood that the words mattered, that gratitude was a shield, and that losing that shield was worse than any punishment he could devise. Esther spoke the words every night without fail, but she never stopped questioning them. Why these specific words? Why gratitude? What was in those woods that required verbal acknowledgement to be kept at bay? She asked no one these questions aloud, but she thought about them constantly. And she paid attention to what happened when the rule was broken. The first time someone forgot to say the words was in November of 1789, 2 months after the rule began. His name was Samuel, a field worker, 40 years old, exhausted from harvest work. He simply fell asleep before speaking the words, too tired to remember. The overseer doing evening rounds noted the omission, reported it to Josiah. Samuel was woken and told to speak the words immediately. He did, confused and frightened. Josiah said nothing more about it. That night passed without incident. So did the next day. People began to think maybe the rule wasn't as absolute as Josiah claimed. Maybe forgetting once wasn't catastrophic. Maybe the words were just Josiah's way of maintaining control, a psychological trick with no real consequences. Then the third night came. Samuel went to sleep in his cabin, surrounded by 5 other men. They all spoke the words before sleep, including Samuel, who was determined never to forget again. But something came anyway. The other men in the cabin woke at exactly the same time, all 5 of them jerking awake with a shared sense of wrongness. Samuel's cot was empty. The door was closed from the inside. The windows were shuttered. Samuel was simply gone, vanished from a locked room. They searched everywhere. The cabins, the fields, the woods, the outbuildings. They found him at dawn, standing at the edge of the woods where the property line met the swamp. He was alive, but he wasn't really there anymore. His eyes were open but unseeing, his mouth moved but no sound came out. He was standing perfectly still, feet bare, nightclothes soaked with dew, and when they tried to move him, he resisted with inhuman strength. It took 6 men to carry him back to the cabins. They laid him on his cot. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't respond to any stimulus. The plantation doctor examined him and found nothing physically wrong. His heart beat. His lungs drew breath. But Samuel was gone, and whatever was using his body wasn't Samuel anymore. He lasted 3 days like that, standing when placed upright, lying when laid down, but never speaking, never showing recognition. On the 3rd day, he simply stopped breathing. His body went cold, that same grey cold that Josiah's family had shown during the fever. And when they prepared him for burial, they found words carved into his skin, carved from the inside out, the letters rising up through the flesh in thin white lines. Contract broken, payment collected. After Samuel, no one forgot the words. No one dared. The mercy rule became absolute, woven into the fabric of daily life at Thornhill so completely that it felt natural, inevitable. Mothers taught their children the words before they could walk. New people brought to the plantation learned the rule on their first night. Even visitors, the rare occasions when someone stayed overnight at Thornhill, were required to speak the words. Josiah was inflexible about this. Everyone under Thornhill's roof, regardless of status or circumstance, spoke the words or faced the consequences. Years passed. The plantation grew. By 1795, there were 92 people at Thornhill, all speaking the same 7 words every night. Josiah never remarried. He ran the plantation with mechanical efficiency, keeping detailed records, maintaining profits, but showing no joy in any of it. He had become a guardian rather than a master, watching over a contract he'd made with something in the woods, ensuring the terms were met, knowing that any failure would cost lives. Esther remained in the main house, aging into a position of quiet authority among the household staff. She was 32 by 1795, respected for her competence and her careful silence. But she was still watching, still trying to understand, and she'd begun to notice patterns. The words had to be spoken between sunset and sleep. Speaking them too early, while the sun was still up, didn't count. Speaking them after waking in the middle of the night was too late. There was a window, roughly 2 to 3 hours after sunset, when the words had power. Outside that window, they were just words. She also noticed that the words had to be spoken on Thornhill property. People who left the plantation for any reason, sent on errands to neighboring farms or into town, didn't have to say the words while away. But the moment they returned to Thornhill, the obligation resumed. The property itself mattered, the boundaries mattered. Whatever Josiah had bargained with was tied to this specific land. And she noticed something else, something that took years of observation to confirm. People who spoke the words with genuine gratitude, who truly felt thankful for Thornhill's protection, seemed healthier. They lived longer. They suffered fewer accidents. It was subtle. Nothing that could be proven, but Esther was certain. The words wanted belief. They wanted sincerity. And those who gave it were rewarded, if you could call survival a reward. In 1801, Josiah's younger brother William arrived from Virginia. He was 28, educated, skeptical, and appalled by what he found at Thornhill. William stayed for 3 weeks, learning about the plantation's operations, and he spent most of that time trying to convince Josiah that the mercy rule was madness. "You're controlling these people with superstition," William argued one evening, his voice carrying from Josiah's study to where Esther worked in the adjacent room. "You've created a mass delusion. That man Samuel probably wandered off in confusion and died of exposure. The marks on his skin were probably post-mortem changes or animal activity. There's a rational explanation for everything." "Then don't say the words tonight," Josiah replied calmly. "Test your rational explanation." There was a long silence. "I'm your brother," William said finally. "You'd risk my life to prove a point." "I'd risk your life to save it," Josiah said. "Say the words, William, or leave Thornhill before sunset." William said the words. He said them every night for the remaining week of his visit. And he never spoke of the mercy rule as superstition again, because on his 4th night at Thornhill, he forgot to close his window before sleep. He woke at midnight to find something standing outside, something that pressed itself against the window screen, something that whispered his name in a voice that sounded like Margaret, Josiah's dead wife. William didn't see it clearly. The night was too dark, but he heard it, and he felt it, the cold radiating through the screen, the wrongness of its presence. "Why are you grateful, William?" it whispered. "Tell me why. Make me believe." William spoke the words then, spoke them through chattering teeth, spoke them with more sincerity than he'd ever managed. The thing at the window listened. Then it withdrew, sliding away into darkness with a sound like wet leaves. William left Thornhill the next morning and never returned. Esther heard about William's encounter from the other household staff. The story spread quickly, whispered in the cabins, repeated in the fields. It became part of Thornhill's mythology, proof that the rule was real, that something was watching, always watching, waiting for the contract to break. And it answered one of Esther's questions. The thing in the woods could test you. It could come to your window, your door, your bedside, and demand proof of your gratitude. Speaking the words wasn't always enough. Sometimes you had to mean them. By 1810, Josiah was 55 and failing. His hair was pure white, his body thin and bent. He'd never recovered from whatever happened the night he buried his family. The plantation had been profitable. Thornhill was now one of the largest in the county, but Josiah took no pride in it. He'd spent 21 years maintaining a contract, and the effort had consumed him. That summer, he began training his nephew, Marcus Thornhill, to take over operations. Marcus was 32, William's son, raised in Virginia but willing to relocate for the inheritance. Josiah spent months teaching Marcus everything about running the plantation, but he spent even more time teaching him about the rule. "The words are everything," Josiah told Marcus repeatedly. "Profits don't matter. Harvest doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that everyone speaks the words, every single night. You enforce this above all else. You make it the foundation of everything. Because the moment the contract breaks, the moment the gratitude stops, this entire plantation dies." Marcus listened. He'd heard the stories. He'd spoken the words himself during his visits, but he'd never fully believed. How could he? He was an educated man living in the 19th century. The world was being explained by science, by reason. The idea that verbal gratitude could protect people from some force in the woods seemed medieval, absurd. Josiah saw the skepticism in Marcus's eyes. In September of 1810, 1 week before Josiah planned to officially transfer ownership, he took Marcus into the woods. They went north, toward the swamp, deeper than Marcus had ever gone. They walked for 2 hours until they reached a place where the trees grew strange, twisted, their bark black and slick, their branches bare, even in late summer. The ground was soft, almost liquid, and the air smelled like copper and old meat. "This is where I buried them," Josiah said, pointing to a clearing ahead. "This is where I made the contract." Marcus looked at the clearing and felt his stomach turn. There were no graves, no markers, just bare ground that seemed to pulse slightly, as if breathing, and there were shapes in the trees around the clearing, shapes that might have been shadows or might have been something solid, hanging in the branches, watching. "What am I looking at?" Marcus whispered. "Payment," Josiah said. "This land was paid for long before I bought it. Something lived here before colonists, before Indians, before humans. Something old enough to have patience, old enough to wait. When I buried my family here, I disturbed something, I broke something, and it offered me a bargain. Let it feed on gratitude instead of lives, and it would protect everything under my protection. I would owe it 7 words every night from every soul at Thornhill, and in exchange it would keep other predators away, human and otherwise. No disease would sweep through, no violence would come to my gates, no external threat would touch Thornhill. As long as the words were spoken, as long as the gratitude was real, Thornhill would be safe." Marcus stared at the clearing, at the shapes in the trees. "And if the words stop?" Josiah looked at him with those hollow eyes. "Then it collects what it's owed, everyone, all at once. That's the contract." They walked back in silence. Marcus didn't speak the entire way. But that night, when it came time to say the words, Marcus spoke them clearly, firmly, with absolute conviction, and he never questioned the rule again. Josiah died in October of 1810, peacefully in his sleep, his final words spoken correctly. Marcus Thornhill took ownership of the plantation and enforced the mercy rule exactly as Josiah had. Nothing changed. The words continued. The contract held. Esther was 47 years old when Marcus took full control of Thornhill. She'd spent 24 years watching the rule operate, 24 years trying to understand its mechanics, and she'd come to a conclusion that both comforted and terrified her. The rule was real, but it wasn't absolute. There were nuances, exceptions, patterns that suggested the thing in the woods operated according to its own logic, its own needs. And if you understood that logic, you might be able to survive, even if the words failed. She began keeping a journal, not on paper, she couldn't risk written evidence, but in her memory. She memorized every incident, every broken rule, every consequence. She created a mental catalogue of Thornhill's hidden history, and what she discovered was disturbing in its implications. Samuel hadn't been the only one taken. In 21 years under Josiah's rule, 7 people had failed to say the words. All 7 had vanished from locked rooms and been found at the edge of the woods in that same empty state. All 7 had died within 3 days. But the pattern wasn't random. The taking always happened on the 3rd night after the omission, never sooner, never later. And it always happened to the person who forgot, never to anyone else. The thing in the woods was precise in its collection, surgical in its punishment. But there was something else, something Esther had noticed but never spoken aloud. The people who were taken weren't random victims of forgetfulness. They were all people who had stopped believing. Samuel had been openly resentful in the days before he forgot, complaining that the rule was just another way to control them. A woman named Ruth, taken in 1794, had been heard saying the words were meaningless, that Josiah had invented the whole thing to keep people afraid. A man named Jacob, taken in 1798, had started saying the words with obvious sarcasm, making them sound like mockery. Every person who was taken had first stopped believing. The forgetting was secondary, a consequence of losing faith in the rule's necessity. The thing in the woods knew the difference between genuine omission and deliberate refusal. This discovery changed everything for Esther, because it meant the rule wasn't just about words, it was about belief, about maintaining a collective faith in the contract's power, and that meant someone who understood the system might be able to manipulate it, might be able to protect others by strengthening their belief, or might be able to target enemies by undermining theirs. It was a dangerous thought, the kind of thought that could get her killed, but Esther couldn't stop thinking it, because she'd seen how power worked at Thornhill, and knowledge was the only power available to her. Marcus Thornhill proved to be a more rigid enforcer than his uncle. Where Josiah had been haunted and withdrawn, Marcus was methodical and controlling. He expanded the rule's requirements, adding a morning acknowledgement to go with the evening gratitude. Nothing as formal as the 7 words, just a brief moment each sunrise, where everyone at Thornhill would face north, toward the woods, and bow their heads in silent recognition. Marcus called it maintaining awareness, but everyone understood it was about reinforcing the contract, reminding the thing in the woods that Thornhill remembered its presence, respected its power. The morning acknowledgement created new problems. People could forget the evening words in exhaustion, but the morning ritual required conscious participation, and some people resisted. A young man named Daniel, 17 years old, refused to bow his head one morning in 1812. He simply stood straight while everyone around him bowed, a small act of defiance but unmistakable. Marcus saw it happen. The entire plantation saw it happen, and everyone waited to see what would come next. Marcus didn't punish Daniel. He didn't even speak to him. He simply made a note in his ledger and continued the morning ritual. Daniel went about his day normally, working the fields, eating with others, showing no ill effects from his refusal. That night, Daniel said the 7 words clearly and correctly. The next morning, he bowed his head with everyone else. The rebellion, if that's what it had been, was over. But 3 nights later, Daniel vanished. They found him at the edge of the woods, that same empty-eyed state, that same grey pallor. He died within 2 days, and the words carved into his skin were different this time. Respect costs nothing, disrespect costs everything. The message was clear. The contract wasn't just about gratitude, it was about submission, about acknowledging the thing in the woods as superior, as worthy of deference. The morning ritual wasn't Marcus's invention, Esther realized. It was the thing's requirement, communicated to Marcus somehow, an evolution of the original contract. The bargain was expanding, demanding more, and Marcus was complying because he understood that refusing would end everything. By 1815, Thornhill had grown to 137 people. The plantation was prosperous beyond any reasonable expectation. While neighboring properties struggled with crop failures, disease, economic downturns, Thornhill thrived. The harvests were always good. No epidemic ever touched the property. Even during the worst seasons, Thornhill's people remained healthy and productive. It was as if the land itself was blessed, as if some force was ensuring success. And in a way, something was. The thing in the woods was keeping its end of the bargain. Protection in exchange for gratitude, safety in exchange for submission. But that protection came with a cost that went beyond the nightly words. Esther noticed that people at Thornhill changed over time, became different from enslaved people on other plantations. They were quieter, more withdrawn, less likely to resist or rebel. Not because they were broken by cruelty, Marcus was actually less violent than most masters, but because they were bound by something deeper than chains. They were bound by belief. The rule had become internalized, had become part of their identity. They weren't just people who said certain words. They were people who understood that their survival depended on maintaining a contract with something inhuman. That knowledge changed you. It made resistance feel pointless. What was the point of fighting human oppressors when something worse waited in the woods? Esther watched this transformation with growing horror because she felt it happening to herself. She'd been at Thornhill for 29 years by 1815. She'd spoken the words 10,000 times, and somewhere along the way, she'd started to believe them. Not just believe in the consequence of not saying them, but believe in their truth. She was grateful for Thornhill's protection, because she knew what waited beyond that protection, and she knew it was worse than anything Marcus could do to her. The rule had made her complicit in her own oppression, and the worst part was she couldn't see another option. This realization broke something in Esther. She began to hate the words she spoke every night, hate the gratitude she felt, hate the relief that came from knowing she was safe as long as she submitted. But she couldn't stop saying them, because the alternative was worse. That year, 1815, something new happened at Thornhill. A woman named Sarah gave birth to twins, 2 girls. It was a difficult birth, and Sarah nearly died, but both babies survived, healthy and strong. Marcus named them himself, as was his right, calling them Grace and Mercy. The names were deliberate, symbolic. Grace and Mercy. Thornhill, born into the rule, born into the contract. These children would never know a world without the 7 words. They would speak their first sentence as toddlers, and that sentence would be, "I am grateful for Thornhill's protection," because that's what everyone around them spoke. The rule would be their native language, their foundational reality. They would never question it because there would be nothing to question. This was simply how the world worked. Esther helped raise Grace and Mercy, and watching them grow was like watching the rule's ultimate victory. These children were perfectly adapted to Thornhill's reality. They said the words with natural ease, without resentment or fear, just as naturally as breathing. And they were happy, or at least as happy as enslaved children could be. They laughed, played, grew strong. The rule didn't burden them because they'd never known anything else. To them, speaking gratitude every night was as normal as eating or sleeping. Marcus saw this too, and Esther watched him come to a realization that changed Thornhill's future. The rule didn't have to be enforced through fear. It could be normalized, internalized, made so fundamental to identity that enforcement became unnecessary. The next generation wouldn't need overseers checking their words. They would police themselves, would feel genuinely grateful, would believe absolutely in the contract's necessity. Marcus began implementing this vision immediately. He created what he called education programs for children at Thornhill, teaching them to read and write, yes, but also teaching them the history of the rule, the story of Josiah's bargain, the importance of the words. He had Esther and other trusted adults tell the children stories about what happened when the rule was broken, making those cautionary tales into a kind of scripture. And he created rituals around the words, making them ceremonial rather than merely obligatory. Every full moon, everyone at Thornhill would gather in the main yard and speak the words in unison, a collective affirmation of the contract. Every solstice, Marcus would lead a procession to the edge of the woods, and they would speak the words facing into the trees, acknowledging the thing that waited there. These rituals served no practical purpose. The nightly individual recitations were sufficient for the contract, but they served a psychological purpose. They made the rule feel sacred, inevitable, permanent. By 1820, Thornhill had become something unique in the South. It was a plantation, yes, with all the horror that implied, but it was also a community bound by shared belief in something beyond human understanding. The people there spoke of the presence or the protection or simply what waits, and they spoke of it with a mixture of fear and genuine gratitude, because the presence kept them safe. It kept disease away. It kept the worst violence away. It even seemed to influence Marcus, making him less cruel than he might otherwise be, because cruelty might break people's ability to feel genuine gratitude, and without that genuine feeling, the words would lose their power. Esther was 57 by 1820, one of the oldest people at Thornhill. She'd seen the rule evolve from Josiah's desperate bargain into Marcus's sophisticated system of control, and she'd come to understand something that filled her with despair. The rule was brilliant in its cruelty. It didn't just control bodies, it controlled hearts and minds. It made people grateful for their chains, because those chains were lighter than what waited in the woods. It made submission feel like wisdom. It made resistance feel like suicide. And worst of all, it worked. Thornhill's people were safer, healthier, longer lived than enslaved people on neighboring plantations. The contract was real. The protection was real. And that made fighting it feel insane. But in 1823, someone tried to fight it anyway. His name was Thomas. He was 24 years old, and he'd been brought to Thornhill just 3 years earlier from a plantation in Alabama. Thomas had never fully accepted the rule. He said the words because he had to, but Esther could hear the hollowness in his voice, could see the anger in his eyes. Thomas didn't believe in the thing in the woods. He thought it was all Marcus's invention, a psychological trick to keep people obedient. And in the summer of 1823, Thomas decided to prove it. He didn't announce his plan. He didn't tell anyone what he intended. He simply stopped saying the words. One night, then two, then three. On the third night, everyone expected Thomas to vanish, to be found at the wood's edge in that empty state. But nothing happened. Thomas woke on the fourth morning perfectly fine, alive, healthy, vindicated in his skepticism. He began to tell others, quietly at first, then more boldly. The rule was fake. The thing in the woods didn't exist. They'd all been controlled by fear of nothing. Some people believed him. A man named Isaac stopped saying the words. A woman named Rebecca stopped. Then 2 more. Then 5 more. Within 2 weeks, 12 people at Thornhill had stopped speaking the nightly gratitude, and nothing happened to any of them. They all remained healthy, functional, alive. Marcus knew what was happening. His evening overseers reported the omissions, but he didn't intervene. He simply watched, his face unreadable, waiting for something. The thing came on the night of the new moon, 3 weeks after Thomas first stopped saying the words. It came for all 12 of them at once. Every person who had stopped speaking gratitude vanished from their beds simultaneously, taken from locked cabins, taken from the main house, taken from rooms where others slept and never woke. In the morning, they found all 12 standing at the edge of the woods, arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward, their eyes empty, their mouths moving silently. They stood there for 5 days. No one could move them. No one could reach them. On the 6th day they all collapsed simultaneously, and when the bodies were examined, every one of them bore the same carved words across their chests. Silence is not freedom. Silence is death. The message was clear, brutal, and effective. Resistance killed not just the resistant, but anyone who followed them. The thing in the woods had patience. It could wait weeks to collect payment, letting hope build, letting rebellion spread, and then crush it all at once, as an example. Thomas's attempted rebellion became part of Thornhill's scripture, a story told to every new person, every child, every visitor. This is what happens when you stop believing. This is what happens when you refuse gratitude. This is the price of freedom. After that night, no one at Thornhill ever questioned the rule again, not openly, not even in whispers. The words became absolute, unquestionable, eternal. Grace and Mercy, now 8 years old, heard the story of Thomas's rebellion and understood that the rule was not just tradition, but survival. They internalized it completely, and they would pass that internalization to their children and their children's children, creating generations for whom the mercy rule was simply reality, unchangeable and unquestionable. Esther watched all of this unfold, and she finally understood Josiah's true genius, or perhaps the thing in the woods' true genius. The contract wasn't just about protection. It was about creating a perfect prison, one where the prisoners guarded themselves, where the walls were belief and the bars were gratitude, and where escape was literally death. Josiah hadn't saved Thornhill with his bargain. He'd damned it. He'd created a system where survival required submission so complete that freedom became unthinkable. And the worst part, the truly damning part, was that it worked. Thornhill thrived, while other plantations suffered. The people there lived longer, suffered less, existed in a state of relative safety that was undeniable. The contract was exploitative, cruel, psychologically devastating, but it was also real, effective, and in its own twisted way, merciful compared to what waited in the woods. By 1830, Marcus was 52 and beginning to plan for succession. He had a son, Richard, who was 23 and learning to run the plantation. Marcus spent years training Richard the same way Josiah had trained him, teaching him that the rule was everything, that the words mattered more than profit or productivity or any other concern. Richard learned well. He spoke the words with his father every night, performed the morning acknowledgment without fail, and showed appropriate respect for the presence in the woods. But Richard also had questions, modern questions, scientific questions. He'd been educated in Savannah, had read books about natural philosophy, about psychology, about mass delusion. And while he didn't doubt that something had happened at Thornhill, he wasn't certain it was supernatural. Maybe Josiah had discovered some natural phenomenon in those woods, some gas that caused hallucinations, some mineral that poisoned the mind. Maybe the people who vanished had been affected by this natural agent, and the words worked not because of a contract with something inhuman, but because belief itself was protective against psychological breakdown. It was still real, in Richard's view, but real in an explainable way. Marcus listened to these theories and said nothing. He'd had similar thoughts as a young man. Then Josiah had taken him into the woods, shown him the clearing, shown him what waited in the trees. Marcus decided Richard needed the same education. In October of 1830, Marcus took Richard north into the swamp, following the same path Josiah had walked 20 years earlier. They reached the clearing where Josiah had buried his family, where the contract had begun. The ground still looked wrong, still seemed to breathe, and the trees were still bare and black and twisted. "Watch," Marcus said quietly, and he called out into the clearing 7 words spoken clearly. "I am grateful for Thornhill's protection." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the shapes in the trees moved. They detached from the branches and descended, not falling but flowing, like liquid shadow taking form. There were dozens of them, maybe more, each one roughly human-shaped but wrong in proportions, wrong in movement. They gathered at the edge of the clearing, facing Marcus and Richard felt his theories crumble into dust. Because these weren't hallucinations, these weren't gas-induced visions. These were real, solid, present in a way that denied rational explanation. One of the shapes moved closer, and Richard saw its face, or what served as a face. It was Margaret, Josiah's dead wife, or something wearing Margaret's face like a mask, the features slightly wrong, the expression too fixed, the eyes too dark. "Thank you," it said in Margaret's voice. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." The words echoed wrong, repeated in overlapping layers as if multiple voices spoke through the same mouth. "Your gratitude feeds us, sustains us, keeps us from hunger. We are grateful for your gratitude. Continue, teach your children, maintain the contract, and we will protect everything you love from everything else that hungers." Then it withdrew, flowing back into the trees, and all the shapes went with it. The clearing was empty again. Marcus turned to Richard. "Still think it's natural philosophy?" Richard shook his head, unable to speak. They walked back in silence, and that night Richard spoke the words with absolute conviction, with genuine gratitude, because he understood now. The thing in the woods wasn't a phenomenon. It was a being, or multiple beings, intelligent and patient and ancient, and it had made a bargain that kept Thornhill safe in exchange for something it valued more than flesh: acknowledgement, gratitude, the recognition of its power. And breaking that bargain would be worse than death. Richard took over Thornhill's operations in 1835 when Marcus's health began failing. He enforced the rule exactly as Marcus had, exactly as Josiah had, because there was no other option. The contract was real. The thing in the woods was real. And the words were the only barrier between survival and annihilation. By this point, 1835, Thornhill had 163 people, all speaking the same 7 words every night, all bowing their heads every morning, all bound by belief in a contract they couldn't escape. Esther was 72 by then, ancient by any standard, her survival itself proof of the rule's effectiveness. She'd outlived Josiah, outlived Marcus, seen the rule pass through 3 generations of Thornhill masters, and she'd come to a strange peace with it. She would die soon, that was certain, but she would die safer than she'd lived on any other plantation, safer than most free people in the world. The rule had stolen her freedom but given her longevity. Was that a fair trade? She didn't know. But she knew she was grateful, genuinely grateful, for being alive to ask the question. Grace and Mercy were now 20 years old, mothers themselves, teaching their own children the words, passing down the contract to the next generation. The rule had become genetic, hereditary, a kind of cultural DNA that defined what it meant to be from Thornhill. And watching Grace teach her 3-year-old daughter to say the words, watching the child repeat them with perfect clarity and innocent belief, Esther saw the future. The rule would outlive everyone currently alive. It would continue for decades, maybe centuries, because it had become self-sustaining. The thing in the woods had created the perfect system, one that required no enforcement, because belief enforced itself. Esther died in 1837, peacefully in her sleep, her final words spoken correctly. She was buried in Thornhill Cemetery, and on her grave marker Richard had carved something unusual, a quote he'd heard her say once in her final years, "Gratitude is a chain we forge ourselves." It was ambiguous, could be read as wisdom or warning, and Richard liked that ambiguity, because the rule was both wisdom that kept people alive and a warning about the cost of survival. The years between 1837 and 1850 were Thornhill's golden age, if such a thing could exist in a place built on slavery and supernatural bargains. The plantation expanded to over 2,000 acres, working 214 people in fields that produced yields other plantations could only dream of. The cotton was always perfect, the soil never exhausted, the weather somehow always favorable when it mattered most. Neighboring plantation owners whispered about Thornhill's impossible success, attributed it to superior management or secret agricultural techniques, never guessing the truth. How could they? The truth was unspeakable, literally beyond the vocabulary of rational discourse. Richard Thornhill was 53 in 1850, grey-haired and weathered but still vital. He'd run Thornhill for 15 years with the same meticulous attention to the rule that his father and great-uncle had maintained. But he'd also added his own innovations. Richard understood that the rule's greatest vulnerability was its dependence on absolute compliance, and absolute compliance required more than fear. It required belonging, identity, pride. So Richard transformed Thornhill's culture, making the rule not just an obligation, but a privilege, something that defined them as special, as chosen. He created what he called the keeper system. 20 trusted individuals, selected for their unwavering belief and their ability to inspire others, were designated as keepers of the mercy rule. These people had special responsibilities: leading the monthly gatherings, telling the stories, teaching the children, and maintaining the emotional and spiritual infrastructure that made the rule work. Grace was one of the keepers, her sister Mercy another. Both women, now 35 years old, had spent their entire lives under the rule and believed in it with religious fervor. They weren't just compliant, they were true believers, people who genuinely felt that the thing in the woods was their protector and that gratitude was proper payment for protection. The keeper system worked brilliantly because it distributed enforcement across the community rather than concentrating it in the master's hands. When someone seemed to be losing faith, showing signs of doubt or resentment, the keepers would intervene, not with threats, but with counseling, reminding the doubter of the rule's history, of what happened when it broke, of why gratitude was not just necessary but right. And most people responded to this approach because it came from their peers, from people they respected and lived alongside. The rule stopped being something imposed from above and became something maintained from within, a collective responsibility that everyone shared. But this success created a new problem. As the rule became more deeply internalized, as belief became more absolute, people at Thornhill began to develop what Richard privately called the dependency. They couldn't imagine life without the rule. The thought of leaving Thornhill, of going somewhere the words weren't required, filled them with existential terror, because without the contract, without the protection, what would keep them safe? The rational answer was, Nothing supernatural threatened them anywhere else, but that answer required believing the thing in the woods was confined to Thornhill, and Richard knew better. He'd seen what waited in that clearing. He'd heard it speak, and while it seemed tied to Thornhill's property, he couldn't be certain that leaving the plantation meant leaving its reach. This uncertainty created a paradox. The people at Thornhill were legally enslaved, but psychologically imprisoned by their own belief. Even if Richard freed them all tomorrow, most would refuse to leave because leaving meant losing the protection they'd depended on their entire lives. The rule had created a form of bondage that transcended legal status, a prison of belief from which there was no escape because the prisoner and the prison were the same thing. In 1851, this paradox was tested in an unexpected way. A man named Abraham, 32 years old, was purchased by Richard from an estate sale in South Carolina. Abraham had spent his life on different plantations, had been sold 7 times, had seen every kind of cruelty the system could devise. He arrived at Thornhill expecting more of the same and was surprised to find something different. The people here were healthier, better fed, less visibly brutalized than anywhere he'd lived. But they were also strange, withdrawn, speaking in whispers about the protection and the words and something in the woods that Abraham couldn't quite understand. On his first night, a keeper named Grace came to explain the rule. Abraham listened with growing disbelief. 7 words spoken every night in exchange for protection from something supernatural? It was absurd, obviously a psychological trick to maintain control. But Grace spoke with such conviction, such genuine belief, that Abraham found himself unsettled. This wasn't someone reciting propaganda. This was someone describing reality as she understood it. When Grace finished her explanation, Abraham asked the obvious question, "What if I don't believe? What if I refuse?" Grace looked at him with something like pity. "Then you'll learn," she said simply. "Everyone learns eventually. Some learn by watching others break the rule. Some learn by breaking it themselves. But everyone learns, because the thing in the woods is patient and it always collects what it's owed." That night, Abraham said the words, not because he believed, but because he was exhausted and wanted to avoid unnecessary trouble. He spoke them mechanically, without conviction, barely audible. But he spoke them. The overseer checking the cabins noted it and moved on. Abraham spent his first weeks at Thornhill trying to understand what he'd entered. He worked the fields, observed the other people, listened to their conversations, and he noticed things that didn't fit. People here were afraid. Yes, but not of the overseers or the master. They were afraid of something else, something they wouldn't name directly. They watched the woods constantly, especially at dusk, as if expecting something to emerge. And the words, those 7 words, were spoken with a ritualistic precision that went far beyond mere compliance. People practiced them, refined their tone, ensured they sounded appropriately grateful. It was like watching a congregation pray, except the God they prayed to lived in the woods and demanded acknowledgement rather than worship. Abraham decided to test the rule, not by refusing to say the words that seemed unnecessarily risky, but by saying them wrong, with obvious sarcasm, making them sound like mockery. He did this for a week, speaking the gratitude with exaggerated insincerity. The overseers noted it, but said nothing. Richard noted it, but took no action. The keepers noticed and began counseling him, but Abraham brushed them off. He was proving a point. The rule was psychological control, nothing more, and speaking the words mockingly would demonstrate that the words themselves had no power. On the 8th night, Abraham woke at midnight. His cabin was cold, impossibly cold for a Georgia summer night. And something was standing at the foot of his cot, something roughly human-shaped but wrong, its edges unclear, as if it was made of shadow that hadn't quite solidified. Abraham tried to speak, tried to scream, but his throat wouldn't work. The thing moved closer, and he saw its face, or rather the absence of face, just darkness, with 2 points of light where eyes might be. "Why are you grateful?" it whispered, the voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Tell me." Make me believe." Abraham couldn't answer. His voice was gone, stolen or frozen. The thing leaned closer, and Abraham felt cold radiating from it, cold that sank into his bones, into his marrow. "You mock the contract," it whispered. "You speak the words but deny their truth. That is worse than silence. Silence is honest. Mockery is betrayal." Then it touched him, just a single touch on his forehead, and Abraham felt something break inside his mind, felt certainty dissolve, felt his entire understanding of reality crack open. The thing withdrew, sliding back into shadows, and Abraham could breathe again, could move again. He spoke the words then, spoke them with absolute sincerity, spoke them with tears streaming down his face, because he understood now. The rule was real. The thing in the woods was real. And gratitude was the only thing keeping that cold, patient hunger at bay. The next morning, Abraham went to Grace and asked to become a keeper. She smiled, sad and knowing, and agreed. Because everyone learned eventually, and those who learned the hard way often became the strongest believers. Abraham spent the rest of his life at Thornhill, 41 more years, and he never spoke the words with anything less than absolute conviction again. He became one of the most effective keepers, able to reach doubters because he'd been a doubter himself, able to explain the rule's reality because he'd experienced its enforcement personally. By 1855, Thornhill had 238 people, all speaking the words, all believers. The rule had achieved something remarkable. It had created genuine gratitude for protection from a threat it itself maintained. It was circular, self-sustaining, perfect in its cruelty. And Richard watched this system operate with a mixture of pride and horror, because he understood what it meant. Thornhill wasn't just a plantation. It was proof that belief could be engineered, that people could be made to love their chains if those chains prevented something worse. The 1,850 seconds brought new tensions to the South, political conflicts over slavery's expansion, economic pressures, growing abolitionist sentiment in the North. Richard watched these developments with concern because instability threatened Thornhill's carefully maintained equilibrium. The rule required consistency, predictability, the assurance that tomorrow would be like today. But the world outside Thornhill was changing rapidly, and change was dangerous for a system built on unchanging certainty. In 1857, Richard's son James turned 30 and began learning to take over the plantation. James was the fourth generation of Thornhills to inherit the contract, and Richard worried about his readiness. James was intelligent, capable, but he'd been educated in Charleston, exposed to modern ideas, progressive thinking about slavery's eventual abolition. James had even expressed sympathy for gradual emancipation, for preparing enslaved people for eventual freedom. These were dangerous ideas to bring to Thornhill, because freedom was incompatible with the rule. How could you free people who believed they needed the protection that only Thornhill provided? How could you release people from physical bondage when they were psychologically imprisoned by their own belief? Richard took James to the clearing in the woods. The same education Richard had received, Josiah had designed. They stood at the edge of that breathing ground, watched the shapes descend from the twisted trees, and James learned what his father, grandfather, and great-great-uncle had learned. The contract was real. The thing in the woods was real. And Thornhill's people couldn't be freed, because freedom meant losing the protection they'd spent 70 years depending on. James emerged from that woods visit changed, his progressive ideas abandoned, his sympathy for abolition replaced by grim acceptance. Thornhill's people weren't enslaved by law alone. They were enslaved by something deeper, by belief so fundamental that legal emancipation would be meaningless, possibly deadly. But the world didn't care about Thornhill's unique circumstances. In 1860, Lincoln was elected. In 1861, war came. South Carolina seceded, then Georgia, then the Confederacy formed, and the nation split apart. Richard died in early 1862, aged 65, his final words spoken correctly, and James took control of Thornhill just as the world around them collapsed into violence. James was 35, running a plantation during a war that threatened to destroy everything. Confederate recruiters came seeking able-bodied men. James provided some, the men from Thornhill who could be spared, but he kept most of his people back because maintaining the rule required population density, required enough people that the nightly words felt like a collective act rather than individual obligation. The war created new pressures. Food became scarce, currency became worthless, the infrastructure of slavery began breaking down as enslaved people on other plantations escaped to Union lines or simply fled into chaos. But at Thornhill, people stayed. They stayed because they believed staying was safer than leaving. They stayed because the rule gave them structure in chaos. They stayed because James, for all his faults, maintained the contract perfectly, ensuring that even during war, even during scarcity, the words were spoken, the mourning acknowledgement performed, the protection maintained. And the thing in the woods kept its end of the bargain. While other plantations were raided, burned, destroyed by Sherman's march, Thornhill remained untouched. Union troops passed within 5 miles, but never approached the property, as if something prevented them from seeing it, from considering it as a target. Confederate deserters roamed the countryside but gave Thornhill a wide berth. The war raged around them, but Thornhill existed in a bubble of strange safety, protected by a bargain made 73 years earlier. Grace and Mercy were 50 years old by 1862, ancient by plantation standards, both long past childbearing but vital in maintaining the rule's cultural infrastructure. They'd become the senior keepers, the wise women who everyone trusted, who everyone turned to for guidance. And they began to sense something changing. The thing in the woods was restless, more active, more demanding. The morning acknowledgement required more time now. People had to bow longer, hold the silence deeper. And the words themselves, though unchanged, required more sincerity, more emotional intensity. It was as if the thing in the woods sensed the chaos outside Thornhill, sensed opportunity, and was testing the contract's limits, seeing how much more it could demand. In 1863, James called a meeting of all the keepers. Grace, Mercy, Abraham, and 17 others gathered in the main house after sunset, something that rarely happened. James looked exhausted, aged beyond his years. "The presence is hungry," he said without preamble, "hungrier than it's been in generations. The war has weakened barriers everywhere else. Places that had their own protections, their own wards, have fallen. And the things that fed in those places are ranging freely now, looking for new territory. Our presence, the thing in the woods, is expending more energy to keep them away, and it wants payment increased." "What does it want?" Abraham asked. "More words," James said. "The morning acknowledgement needs to happen at dawn, not just sunrise, and the evening words need to be spoken at sunset, not just before sleep. Twice daily, at specific times, with absolute compliance. And it wants witnesses. Wants the words spoken in the open where it can hear clearly, not muffled in cabins or hidden in rooms." The keepers absorbed this. Doubling the requirement was significant, but doable. "There's more," James said quietly. "It wants proof. Once a month it wants someone to go to the clearing, to speak the words there directly, to renew the contract explicitly." The room went silent. Going to the clearing was dangerous, had always been dangerous. Only Thornhill masters had done it, only people with authority to negotiate the contract. Sending others seemed like offering them as potential payment. "I'll go," Grace said immediately. Mercy nodded agreement. Abraham did as well. Others volunteered. James felt relief flood through him. The keepers would maintain the contract, even under increased demands, because they believed absolutely. The thing in the woods had chosen its priesthood well. The new requirements went into effect in April of 1863. People at Thornhill now gathered twice daily, at dawn and sunset, in the main yard. They faced north toward the woods and spoke the 7 words in unison, their voices carrying across the fields, loud enough for anything listening to hear clearly. The sound was eerie, haunting, 200 voices speaking identical gratitude in perfect synchronization. And once a month, on the new moon, a keeper would walk into the woods, go to the clearing, and speak the words directly to the shapes that waited in the trees. Grace made the first journey in May of 1863. She walked alone into the woods at midnight, carrying no light, guided by memory and something else, a pull she felt toward the clearing, as if the path itself wanted her to find it. She reached the clearing and spoke the words, her voice steady despite terror that threatened to choke her. The shapes descended and listened. Then, one of them, wearing a face that might have once been Margaret Thornhill, spoke, "Thank you," it said. "The contract continues. Thornhill remains protected. Your faith sustains us, feeds us, keeps us strong enough to hold territory against what else hungers. Continue, teach, believe, and we will guard you unto the end." Grace walked back, took hours to reach the plantation because the path seemed longer in darkness. She collapsed when she reached her cabin, slept for 16 hours, and woke different. She'd been close to the thing in the woods, closer than anyone except Thornhill Masters, and proximity changed you. Grace could feel the presence now, feel it watching constantly, feel its hunger and its patience. She understood that the contract wasn't just words and protection. It was relationship, parasitic but mutual. The thing in the woods fed on their gratitude, drew strength from their belief, and in exchange shaped reality around Thornhill to keep them safe. They were bound together, interdependent, neither able to exist without the other. The war continued. 1,863 became 1,864, then 1,865. The Confederacy collapsed. Sherman burned his way through Georgia, leaving devastation in his wake. But Thornhill remained untouched, a strange island of continuity in a destroyed world. And then, in April of 1865, the war ended. Lincoln emancipated the slaves. The Confederacy surrendered. Everything changed. Everything except Thornhill. Because how do you emancipate people who are imprisoned by belief? How do you free people who think freedom means death? James gathered everyone in the main yard on April 20th, 1865, and told them they were legally free, that slavery had ended, that they could leave Thornhill whenever they wished. The announcement was met with silence, complete silence, because no one wanted to leave. Leaving meant losing the protection. Leaving meant facing whatever waited in the world without the contract's shield. They'd spent 76 years believing that Thornhill's protection was all that kept them alive, and legal emancipation didn't change that belief, couldn't change it. "You can stay," James continued, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "You can continue living here, working here, speaking the words. The contract remains even if the law has changed. The presence doesn't care about emancipation, it only cares about gratitude. So stay, be paid for your work now, live as free people under Thornhill's protection, or leave and take your chances with what waits beyond the property line." Everyone stayed, every single person, because the rule had become their identity, their reality, their only understanding of how to survive. They were free in law but imprisoned in belief, and the prison was so complete they couldn't even perceive the bars. Over the following weeks, a few people did attempt to leave. A young man named Daniel, 23 years old, who'd heard stories of opportunities in the North, of land available for former slaves, of actual freedom beyond words and rules. Daniel said his goodbyes, packed what little he owned, and walked off Thornhill's property on a bright May morning. He made it 3 miles. They found him that evening, standing at a crossroads, his eyes empty, his mouth moving silently. He was speaking the 7 words, repeating them endlessly, trying to invoke protection that no longer applied. Whatever he'd encountered in those 3 miles had broken him. They brought him back to Thornhill, and he recovered after a week, but he never tried to leave again. Daniel's experience confirmed what everyone suspected. The protection didn't extend beyond Thornhill's borders, and the things that waited outside, whether supernatural or simply the dangers of the post-war South, were worse than the rule's requirements. Thornhill became a refuge, a place where former slaves voluntarily remained because everywhere else seemed more dangerous. And the thing in the woods accepted this arrangement because it still received what it wanted: gratitude, belief, acknowledgement, spoken twice daily by people who meant every word. If you're still with me, if this story hasn't driven you away yet, I need you to do something for me. Share this video with someone, anyone, who thinks they understand history. Leave a comment telling me what you think is really in those woods at Thornhill, and subscribe to The Sealed Room, because we're not done yet. The darkest part of this story is still coming, and you need to hear how it ends. Or rather, how it doesn't end. Because some contracts never expire. The years between 1865 and 1880 were strange ones at Thornhill. The people there existed in legal freedom but practical bondage, working the land for wages but bound by belief in the rule's necessity. James paid them, not much, but enough to technically satisfy the new labor laws. And people stayed, because Thornhill remained supernaturally safe while the surrounding counties descended into Reconstruction violence, into Klan terror, into economic collapse and social chaos. The thing in the woods kept its bargain, protecting Thornhill from external threats, ensuring that whatever horrors swept through Georgia, none touched the plantation's boundaries. But the protection came with escalating costs. The thing in the woods demanded more. Always more. By 1870, the words had to be spoken 3 times daily, at dawn, noon, and sunset. By 1875, the monthly journey to the clearing became weekly. By 1880, the presence required blood. Not much, just a few drops from each person once a month, collected in a bowl and poured at the clearing's edge. James implemented this requirement with grim resignation, because refusing would break the contract, and breaking the contract would kill everyone. The people at Thornhill accepted it because they'd accepted everything else, because they'd been conditioned across generations to accept that survival required sacrifice, and blood was just another price to pay. Grace and Mercy were 68 years old by 1880, impossibly old, their survival itself evidence of the protection's power. Both women had outlived everyone from their generation, had seen children grow old and grandchildren reach adulthood, and they'd begun to understand something terrible. The rule was becoming stronger, more demanding, because the thing in the woods was growing. It fed on their belief, their gratitude, their blood, and with each feeding it grew more powerful, more present, more able to influence reality around Thornhill. What had started as a desperate bargain was evolving into something else entirely, a symbiotic relationship where Thornhill's people fed a god of their own making, and that god protected them because it needed them, needed their faith, their words, their life force. In 1882, James died at the age of 55. His son, William, 32, inherited Thornhill and the contract. William was the 5th generation to maintain the rule, and he'd known nothing else his entire life. The words were his first memory, his native language, his understanding of how reality functioned. He enforced the rule not through fear but through genuine belief, because to William the rule wasn't oppressive. It was simply true as gravity or sunlight. Under William's leadership, Thornhill evolved further. He formalized the keeper system into an actual priesthood, creating robes and rituals and a hierarchical structure that resembled organized religion. Grace and Mercy became the high keepers, spiritual leaders who guided the community's faith. The monthly blood offering became a ceremony, a sacred ritual performed with solemn precision, and the words themselves became scripture, recited not just at required times, but throughout the day, woven into conversations, used as greetings and farewells. "I am grateful for Thornhill's protection" became less a requirement and more a mantra, a constant affirmation of belief. By 1890, Thornhill had effectively become a cult. The people there were legally free but psychologically enslaved to the rule, and they didn't see this as oppression. They saw it as enlightenment. They understood something the outside world didn't, that reality was negotiable, that protection could be purchased with belief, that survival required acknowledging powers greater than human authority. And they were grateful, genuinely grateful, because everywhere else in the South was dangerous, while Thornhill remained safe. The thing in the woods had proven its worth across a century of protection, and that proof made belief easy, rational, obvious. But in 1895, something changed. Grace died peacefully at the age of 80, the oldest person anyone at Thornhill had ever known. Her final words were spoken correctly, and she was buried with full ceremonial honors. Her death was expected, natural, appropriate. Mercy's death 3 days later was none of those things. Mercy was the same age as Grace, equally healthy, showing no signs of illness. She went to sleep speaking the words and simply never woke up. Her body was cold, gray, marked with those carved letters: contract satisfied, service complete. The message was clear and horrifying. The thing in the woods had taken Mercy deliberately, had ended her life as payment for something, possibly for Grace's natural death, possibly for some other debt. The contract wasn't just about protection anymore. It was about ownership. The thing in the woods could take anyone, any time, regardless of compliance, and call it payment. The people of Thornhill were no longer protected by the rule. They were owned by it. Mercy's death changed everything at Thornhill, though not in the way an outsider might expect. The people didn't rebel. They didn't question the contract or attempt to leave. Instead, they doubled down on their faith, interpreting Mercy's taking as proof of the thing in the woods' power, as evidence that the contract demanded not just words and blood, but absolute devotion. If the presence could take someone as faithful as Mercy, then no one was safe except through perfect compliance, through gratitude so genuine and complete that it became indistinguishable from love. William understood this psychology and used it. He declared Mercy a martyr, someone taken not as punishment, but as ascension, called to serve the presence more directly. Her death became part of Thornhill's mythology, a story told to strengthen rather than weaken belief. And it worked. People at Thornhill became more devout, more careful with their words, more elaborate in their rituals. The 3 daily recitations expanded to 5. The weekly journey to the clearing became daily, with keepers taking turns making the pilgrimage. The blood offering increased from once monthly to once weekly, and people gave it willingly, eagerly, because they believed it kept them safe. But William knew something the others didn't, something he'd learned from his father and grandfather in whispered conversations late at night. The contract was finite. It had always been finite. Josiah had made a bargain for protection, but he'd never negotiated the duration. The thing in the woods had agreed to protect Thornhill, but it had never specified for how long. And William suspected that Mercy's death marked the beginning of the end, the point where the presence began collecting not just payment, but principle, taking back what it had invested in Thornhill's protection across more than a century. He tried to negotiate, tried to offer more, tried to extend the contract's terms. He made the journey to the clearing himself in January of 1896, something Thornhill masters rarely did anymore, and he spoke to the shapes in the trees. "What more do you need?" he asked. "What will ensure the contract continues?" The thing wearing Margaret's face descended and regarded him with those 2 dark eyes. "Nothing," it said simply. "The contract continues until it doesn't. We protected you for 106 years. We kept disease away, kept violence away, kept the world's chaos from touching your gates. We did this in exchange for gratitude, for acknowledgement, for the faith that fed us and made us strong enough to hold territory against other hungers. But contracts end, William Thornhill. All contracts end. And when ours ends, we will take what we're owed." "What are you owed?" William asked, though he already knew. "Everything," the presence said. "Everyone. Every soul that spoke the words, every drop of blood spilled at our feet, every moment of belief and fear and gratitude. We own Thornhill now. You made your ancestors' bargain binding on all who came after. Every person who spoke the words entered the contract willingly, made themselves ours. And when the contract concludes, we collect. William walked back from that clearing knowing Thornhill was doomed. The question was, when? How much time remained before the presence decided collection was due? Months? Years? Decades? He couldn't know, and the uncertainty was perhaps the cruelest part. He could warn everyone, could tell them the truth, could give them the chance to flee. But where would they go? What would they do? They'd spent generations believing that only Thornhill's protection kept them alive. Telling them that protection was ending would destroy them psychologically, even if they physically escaped. So William said nothing. He maintained the rule. He enforced the rituals. He let people believe they were safe. Let them find comfort in their faith. Let them speak their gratitude with sincere conviction. Because what else could he do? The contract was binding. The thing in the woods owned them all. And the only mercy left was ignorance, was letting people live their final years, months, or days in the illusion of safety. Through the late 1890 seconds and into the new century, Thornhill continued its strange existence. The people there aged, new children were born, life proceeded with eerie normalcy. But William watched the woods, watched the presence grow stronger, more visible, more present. The shapes in the trees were darker now, more solid, less shadow, and more substance. The clearing's ground pulsed more obviously, its breathing rhythm faster, hungrier, and people who made the daily pilgrimage came back changed, came back with that same distant look that marked those taken in the past, though they remained functional, remained alive. For now, in 1905, William died at age 55, the same age his father had died, the same age his grandfather had died. There was a pattern there, a price for maintaining the contract, a shortened lifespan for those who bore the weight of knowing the truth. William's son, Robert, 35 years old, inherited Thornhill and received the same education his father, grandfather, and great-great-grandfather had received. Robert went to the clearing, he spoke to the presence, and he learned that the contract had 10 years remaining, that in 1915, exactly 126 years after Josiah's original bargain, the thing in the woods would collect everything. Robert emerged from those woods with a choice. He could maintain the deception, could let Thornhill continue for another decade in blissful ignorance, or he could tell the truth and give people the chance to flee, to take their chances in the outside world. He chose truth. In March of 1905, Robert gathered everyone at Thornhill, all 217 people, and told them everything. He told them about Josiah's bargain, about the contract's true nature, about Mercy's death being the beginning of collection, about the Presence's plan to take everyone in 1915. He told them they had 10 years to leave, to build lives elsewhere, to escape before the contract concluded. The response was not what Robert expected. A few people, maybe 20, chose to leave immediately. They packed what they could carry and walked off Thornhill's property that same day, preferring to face the uncertain dangers of the outside world rather than wait for certain doom. But the rest stayed. They stayed because they didn't believe Robert's warning, or because they believed it but didn't care, or because they'd spent so many generations at Thornhill that leaving felt like death regardless of what waited. If they stayed, they'd made their choice, had internalized the rule so completely that it had become their identity, and abandoning Thornhill meant abandoning themselves. Robert let them stay. He continued maintaining the rule, continued enforcing the rituals, but he stopped lying about their purpose. Everyone now knew they weren't being protected. They were being prepared, fattened like livestock, kept healthy and faithful so the Presence could harvest them more efficiently when the time came. And knowing this didn't change behavior. People still spoke the words 3 times daily. They still made the pilgrimage to the clearing. They still gave blood willingly. because the rule was all they knew, and without it they were nothing. The decade between 1905 and 1915 was Thornhill's twilight, a slow descent into apocalypse that everyone could see coming, but no one could prevent. People aged rapidly, as if time accelerated on the property. Children born in 1905 looked like adults by 1910. Adults in their 30s developed grey hair, stooped postures, the physical markers of extreme age. The presence was feeding more aggressively now, drawing life force directly rather than waiting for it to be offered. And still people stayed, still they spoke the words, still they maintained faith in a contract they knew would kill them. By 1914, Thornhill's population had declined to 143. Some had died of natural causes, though natural was a relative term when the presence was involved. Some had finally fled, unable to maintain the delusion anymore. But most remained, committed to seeing the contract through to its conclusion, believing somehow that their faith would be rewarded, that perfect compliance might earn mercy even from something that had never promised it. Robert was 54 in 1914, grey and worn, looking 20 years older than his actual age. He'd spent 9 years watching his people decay, watching the presence grow stronger, watching the inevitable approach. And he'd made a decision. If the contract was going to take everyone, if collection was unavoidable, then he would try to break it, would try to destroy the thing in the woods before it could complete its harvest. It was probably futile, certainly dangerous, but doing nothing felt like cowardice. He spent months researching, traveling to libraries in Atlanta and Charleston, consulting with scholars of folklore and anthropology, looking for any precedent, any case where a supernatural contract had been broken or renegotiated. What he found was discouraging. Contracts with inhuman entities were considered binding across virtually every cultural tradition. The only way to break them was to destroy one party completely, and destroying an entity that had fed on belief for over a century seemed impossible. But Robert found one potential weakness. The presence had grown powerful by feeding on Thornhill's people, but that power was dependent on continued belief. If everyone at Thornhill simultaneously stopped believing, stopped speaking the words, stopped acknowledging the presence's power, it might weaken enough to be banished or destroyed. The challenge was convincing people to abandon faith they'd held their entire lives, faith that had been reinforced across 5 generations, faith that had become their fundamental reality. In January of 1915, 6 months before the contract's conclusion, Robert proposed his plan at a gathering of everyone remaining at Thornhill. "The presence feeds on our belief," he said. "It has always fed on our belief. Our gratitude, our fear, our acknowledgement, that's what makes it strong. If we all stop, if we refuse the words, refuse the rituals, refuse to acknowledge its power, it will starve. It might not die, but it will weaken enough that we can fight it, can break the contract before it collects." The response was divided. About 40 people, mostly younger ones who'd heard Robert's warnings and lived under the shadow of approaching doom, agreed to try. They would stop speaking the words, stop feeding the presence, and see what happened. But the rest, about 100 people, refused. They couldn't abandon the rule. It was too deeply woven into their identity. Asking them to stop speaking, the words was like asking them to stop breathing. They would maintain faith until the end, would speak their gratitude even as the presence took them, because that's what Thornhill people did. Robert realized he couldn't save everyone. Some people were too far gone, too thoroughly indoctrinated to be reached. So he focused on the 40 who were willing to try, who were willing to risk the presence's immediate wrath in exchange for the possibility of escape. In February of 1915, those 40 people stopped speaking the words. They stopped attending the daily recitations. They stopped making pilgrimages to the clearing. They stopped giving blood. They broke the contract deliberately, hoping to weaken the presence before it could collect. The response was immediate and terrible. The presence came for them that first night, came for all 40 simultaneously, dragging them from their beds, pulling them toward the woods. But they fought, resisted, refused to go willingly. And because they'd stopped believing, because they'd withdrawn their faith, the presence's power over them was weakened. It couldn't simply take them, it had to force them, and force required energy, required effort that the presence had never needed before. The battle lasted 3 days, 40 people fighting against something that had owned them their entire lives, fighting with nothing but refusal, with denial of the presence's authority. Some were taken, dragged into the woods screaming, never seen again. But others held on, held their disbelief so firmly that the presence couldn't grasp them. And slowly, visibly, the presence weakened. The shapes in the trees became less solid. The clearing's ground stopped pulsing. The pressure that had hung over Thornhill for 126 years began to lift. By the 4th day, 23 of the original 40 remained alive and free. The presence had taken 17, but couldn't take more without exhausting itself completely, and Robert saw his opportunity. He gathered the 23, armed them with axes and torches, tools that were probably useless against something supernatural but gave them psychological strength, and led them into the woods toward the clearing. They reached it at sunset on February 14th, 1915. The clearing was different now, the ground cracked and dry, the trees withered, the shapes that had hung there for over a century barely visible. The presence was starving, weakened by the withdrawal of belief, by the loss of its food source. Robert stepped forward and spoke, not the 7 words of gratitude, but words of banishment, of rejection, of absolute denial. "We don't believe in you," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing. "We don't acknowledge your power. We don't accept your contract. You fed on our fear and our faith for 126 years, but that's over. You're nothing without our belief. You're nothing without our words. And we're done giving you either." The presence tried to respond, tried to manifest, tried to enforce the contract's terms, but it was too weak. The shapes in the trees dissolved, the ground's breathing stopped, and the clearing became just a clearing, just dirt and dead trees with nothing supernatural remaining. The contract was broken. The presence was banished. Thornhill was free. But freedom came at a cost. The 100 people who had remained faithful, who had continued speaking the words even as others fought, felt the presence's departure like a physical wound. They'd spent their entire lives believing they needed that protection, that only Thornhill's contract kept them safe, and suddenly it was gone. They were exposed, vulnerable, facing a world without the shield they'd depended on. Many couldn't handle it. Some died immediately, their bodies simply giving out as if the presence had been the only thing keeping them alive. Others went mad, their minds breaking under the weight of sudden vulnerability. Within a week, 90 of the 100 faithful were dead, killed not by the presence but by its absence, by the loss of the belief structure that had defined their reality. The remaining 10 faithful, along with Robert's 23 fighters, became Thornhill's final population. 33 people where there had once been 217. They buried the dead, all 184 who had died in the contract's breaking, in a mass grave at the edge of the woods. And then they faced a question that had no good answer. What now? Thornhill without the rule was just a plantation, just land and buildings with no supernatural significance. The thing in the woods was gone, banished or dead. It didn't matter which. The contract was broken. They were free in every meaningful sense, but they were also traumatized, damaged, psychologically scarred by generations of enforced belief. How do you build a normal life after that? Most of them couldn't. Over the following year, 25 of the 33 left Thornhill, scattered to cities and towns across the South, trying to find places where the memories wouldn't follow. They left behind Robert and 7 others, the only ones who felt like staying, who felt like the land still held some meaning, even without the contract. Robert lived at Thornhill until 1920, maintaining the property, keeping the buildings in repair, trying to convince himself that breaking the contract had been worth the cost. But the guilt ate at him. He'd saved 33 people but killed 184, killed them by destroying the belief system they'd needed to survive. Had he done the right thing? He never knew. He died at age 60, alone in the plantation house, and his final words, spoken to no one, were, "I am grateful for Thornhill's protection." Even after everything, even after breaking the contract, he couldn't stop saying the words. They'd been too deeply ingrained. After Robert's death, Thornhill was abandoned. The remaining 7 people left, moving to Atlanta or Charleston or farther north. The plantation sat empty for decades, the buildings slowly collapsing, the fields reclaimed by forest. By 1950, nothing remained but foundations and a few standing walls. The land was sold several times, divided into parcels, developed into residential properties. The clearing in the woods was bulldozed to build houses. The mass grave was paved over, became part of a shopping center parking lot. Thornhill disappeared from physical reality, erased by progress and time. But it never completely disappeared, because the 20 people who had fled in 1905, when Robert first warned them, survived. They built lives in other places, had children, passed down the story of Thornhill and the Mercy Rule. Those children told their children, and their children told theirs, and the story spread, mutated, became folklore. By the 1962, dozens of families across the South traced their ancestry to Thornhill and knew the story of the rule, of the contract, of the price their ancestors had paid for protection. In 1982, a historian researching Reconstruction-era Georgia found references to Thornhill in old census records and became curious. The plantation had an unusually stable population for decades, almost no turnover, no recorded sales or purchases of enslaved people after 1850. It was as if people arrived at Thornhill and never left. The historian, a woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, began investigating more deeply, tracking down descendants, collecting oral histories, trying to piece together what had made Thornhill unique. What she found disturbed her so much that she almost didn't publish it, because the descendants all told variations of the same story, the rule, the words, the thing in the woods, the contract, and they all reported the same lingering effect. Their ancestors who had lived at Thornhill, even those who'd escaped in 1905, even those who'd survived the contract's breaking, never stopped saying the words. They'd speak them before sleep every night until they died, unable to break the habit, unable to stop acknowledging a presence that no longer existed. And some of the descendants, people who'd never lived at Thornhill, who'd never been bound by the contract, felt compelled to say the words anyway, as if the rule had become genetic, inherited, passed down through blood and memory. Dr. Mitchell published her findings in 1,985 inches, an obscure academic journal. The article attracted little attention, was dismissed by most scholars as unreliable oral history mixed with folklore. But descendants of Thornhill read it and recognized their own experiences. And they began connecting with each other, forming networks, sharing stories, trying to understand what they'd inherited from their ancestors. What they discovered was disturbing. Many of them, despite never living at Thornhill, despite the contract being broken 70 years earlier, still felt watched, still felt a presence, faint but real, observing them, still felt safest when they spoke those 7 words before sleep. The contract might be broken, but its psychological effects persisted across generations, had become embedded in their families like genetic trauma, passed from parent to child without conscious effort. In 1995, a group of Thornhill descendants, about 40 people, made a pilgrimage to the site of the old plantation. Nothing remained of the original structures, but they found the general location using old property maps. They stood where the main house had been, where their ancestors had gathered daily to speak the words, and they performed a ceremony, not of gratitude, but of release, of letting go, of finally breaking the psychological bondage that had outlived the physical contract by 8 decades. They spoke the words one final time, all together. I am grateful for Thornhill's protection. Then they renounced them, rejected them, denied their power. And several people reported feeling something lift, feeling lighter, feeling a pressure they'd carried their entire lives finally release. But others felt nothing change. The rule still had power over them, or they believed it did, which amounted to the same thing. One woman, a descendant named Jennifer Thornhill, great-great-great-granddaughter of Robert, said something during that ceremony that Dr. Mitchell recorded. "We think we're free because the contract ended, but the contract never ended. It just changed. Our ancestors traded their freedom for safety, and we inherited that trade. We're still trading, still choosing safety over freedom every time we speak those words, even knowing they're empty. The thing in the woods might be gone, but it won. It proved that belief is stronger than reality, that fear is a chain we forge ourselves, and that some prisons survive long after the walls crumble." The site where Thornhill once stood is now a subdivision called Maryhill Estates, developed in 2003. About 200 families live there, most of them unaware of the land's history. But some residents report strange experiences. Feeling watched when walking near the wooded area at the development's edge, hearing voices at night, multiple voices speaking in unison, too distant to make out words but rhythmic, ritualistic. And several children in the subdivision have independently started saying the same phrase before bed, without being taught, without knowing why. 7 words that their parents don't recognize, but that some find oddly familiar, oddly comforting. "I am grateful for Thornhill's protection." The parents usually dismiss it as a coincidence, as something the children picked up from each other at school. But a few parents, those who've researched the property's history, those who've found Dr. Mitchell's article, or connected with Thornhill descendants online, understand what it means. The rule is still operating. The contract might be broken, the presence might be gone, but the belief structure remains, embedded in the land itself, in the collective unconscious of anyone who lives there. Thornhill's final victory wasn't controlling its people while they lived under the rule. It was ensuring that the rule would outlive everyone who knew its origin, would become instinct, would reproduce itself across generations through psychological inheritance rather than supernatural enforcement. In 2018, Dr. Mitchell published a follow-up study. She'd been tracking Thornhill descendants for 33 years, documenting their experiences, their families, their children. What she found was that the compulsion to speak the words was declining. Each generation felt it less strongly than the previous one. The great-great-great-grandchildren of Thornhill's people rarely felt any compulsion at all. The rule was fading, dying out as memory faded, as the trauma became too distant to affect daily life. But it hadn't died completely. And Dr. Mitchell's conclusion, stated carefully in academic language but devastating in its implications, was that the mercy rule represented a kind of psychological perpetual motion machine, a belief system so perfectly designed that it could sustain itself across generations without external enforcement. Josiah Thornhill, whether he knew it or not, had created something that approached immortality. Not physical immortality, but mimetic immortality, an idea that could reproduce itself, adapt to changing circumstances, and survive long after its origin was forgotten. The thing in the woods might have been real. It might have been nothing but shared delusion. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that 200 people believed absolutely, believed enough to sacrifice their freedom, their autonomy, their lives. And that belief created reality, shaped behavior, ensured compliance more effectively than any physical force could have. The rule didn't need to be real to work, it just needed to be believed. And that's the true horror of Thornhill. Not that something supernatural demanded gratitude in exchange for protection, but that belief in that demand was sufficient to create the system, to enforce it, to make it real in every way that mattered. The people of Thornhill were imprisoned by their own minds, enslaved by their own faith, and they called it mercy, because the alternative was admitting they'd been fooled, that they'd given everything for nothing, that they'd spent generations in bondage to a contract that might never have existed. When Sherman's forces finally did reach Thornhill in November of 1864, they found the buildings empty, the fields unharvested, and every surface carved with those words, we stopped saying it. But that wasn't the whole truth. They hadn't stopped. They couldn't stop. Even in 1864, before Robert's warning, before the contract's breaking, people at Thornhill were still speaking the words, still maintaining the rule. The carvings were a lie, or a prophecy, or a wish. A statement of what they wanted to be true but wasn't, not yet. Not for another 51 years. The journalist from Harper's Weekly who investigated in 1866 was named Edmund Cass. He spent 2 weeks at the abandoned plantation, interviewing the few people who remained in the area, reading through records Robert had left behind, trying to understand what had happened. And he wrote a comprehensive article detailing everything, the rule, the contract, the thing in the woods, the price of protection. Then he burned it. Burned every page, every note, every piece of evidence. Because he understood that publishing the story would give it power, would spread the belief, would risk creating new Thornhills wherever people read about the mercy rule and thought, maybe, just maybe, that kind of protection was worth the cost. But he couldn't burn the idea. And the idea survived, passed through oral tradition, through whispered stories, through descendants who carried the memory even as they tried to forget. It survived because it was useful, because people in desperate situations, people facing impossible dangers, people with no other options, sometimes needed to believe that protection was available, that survival could be purchased with submission, that speaking the right words at the right time could keep the darkness at bay. The mercy rule is still operating today. Not at Thornhill, that contract ended in 1915, but elsewhere, in other places where people make bargains with things they don't understand, where they trade freedom for safety, where they speak words of gratitude to powers that may or may not be real. The specific words change, the specific entity changes, but the structure remains. Speak the words, show gratitude, maintain belief, and you'll be protected. Maybe. The question Dr. Mitchell asks at the end of her 2018 study, the question that haunts everyone who learns about Thornhill, is simple. If you lived there in 1790, knowing what Josiah knew, seeing what he'd seen, would you have spoken the words? Would you have accepted the contract? Would you have chosen safety over freedom? Most people say no. They say they'd refuse, they'd run, they'd take their chances with whatever waited in the woods rather than submit to supernatural bondage. But they're answering from safety, from a position where they don't have to make that choice. The people at Thornhill didn't have that luxury. They made their choice under pressure, under threat, under circumstances where refusing might mean immediate death. And once they made that choice, once they spoke those first words, every subsequent word became easier, became habitual, became inevitable. That's how the mercy rule worked, not through dramatic conversion but through incremental submission, through small daily choices that accumulated into absolute bondage. The first time you spoke the words, it was survival. The 100th time, it was habit. The 10,000th time, it was identity. And by then, you weren't speaking the words because you had to. You were speaking them because you couldn't imagine not speaking them, because they'd become the foundation of your reality, because stopping would mean destroying yourself. And maybe that's what the thing in the woods understood from the beginning. Maybe Josiah's bargain wasn't about trading protection for gratitude. Maybe it was about demonstrating that humans will imprison themselves given the right incentive. That belief is the strongest chain because we forge it ourselves and call it freedom. The mercy rule didn't end in 1915 when Robert broke the contract. It ended when the last person who felt compelled to speak those words finally stopped. And according to Dr. Mitchell's research, that hasn't happened yet. Somewhere, someone descended from Thornhill still speaks 7 words before sleep, still feels grateful for protection that ended a century ago, still maintains a contract with something that might never have existed. The rule persists, the prison remains, and freedom, true freedom, stays forever out of reach. Because some chains don't need to be real to bind you, they just need to be believed.